And thank you to the organizers, not only for the invitation, but also for organizing an event to talk about and reflect on oceans and the right to science. I am very pleased to join this conversation, and I would first want to recall that back in the negotiations of the Law of the Sea Convention, so this is just after the Stockholm Conference on the Human Environment that we're celebrating 50 years this year, perhaps the protection of the marine environment is and was the most important element of progressive development that was introduced ultimately in what became the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. And this part on the protection of the environment is pivotal, is critical, because it changes the paradigm from a situation that existed previously where the oceans were regarded as the dumping ground and the trash can of humanity, to a new paradigm of protection where the international community recognizes the duties to protect the marine environment. But this change in paradigm and in a way the promise of clean and healthy oceans will not come to be realized unless the right to science is also implemented, unless scientific evidence is really given a place in the elaboration of oceans policy. With this reflection, I also want to recall that my first report to the Human Rights Council in 2021, so last year, focused on the right to science. And this was because of the real gulf that exists between the science on chemicals and wastes and the regulatory responses. There's a real disconnect and misalignment. Now, this gap is not an accident. It results from the deliberate attacks against science, attacks against scientists that speak out, harassment, threats, defunding. Scientists have been fired from their university positions or otherwise denied funding, as well as disinformation for profit. The spread of disinformation on the science of toxics has become quite a lucrative business. Not only on toxics, we can speak about climate change, we can speak about so many areas of environmental policy that have been subject to misinformation. Here we see mercenary scientists for hire to confuse society, to divert action, to delay action, and all in the meantime, certain corporate interests continue to make money out of the expense of environmental protection and the health of people. It is often that we see that the tactics are following the 1950s playbook that was developed by the tobacco industry when it was confronted with evidence on the dangers of tobacco smoking and the dangers of secondhand tobacco smoking. So the quest for alternative explanations, it's not this, it's this other thing, or claiming lack of proof. We don't have the evidence, or we need additional evidence, we need additional research, and so paralysis by analysis. Or the funding of front groups, groups that appear to advocate for environmental protection or protection of human health, but in reality are there to advance the talking points of industry's tactics to divert or to delay. And so despite the knowledge that we have on the risks and harms of hazardous substances, people all over the world are exposed to toxics. And this has implications for the effective enjoyment of a range of internationally protected human rights. We can identify a few situations: highly hazardous pesticides that are still produced and exported from industrialized countries to developing countries, despite that industrialized countries have banned them because of their health and environmental unacceptable impacts. Another example is the thousands of toxic chemicals that are added to plastics, which impede a circular economy, impede recycling, and contaminate not only rivers and the land, but also the oceans. Mercury is still allowed for use in small-scale gold mining. This is a serious shortcoming of the Minamata Convention on Mercury. As we know, small-scale gold mining is the largest emitter of mercury to the environment. We also know that mercury is a persistent metal that bioaccumulates, so eventually it finds its way to the oceans, not just the vapors, the releases to the atmosphere, but also emissions to the environment more generally, and affects coastal communities worldwide. There have been studies of women in childbearing age in small island developing states that have shown exposure to levels of mercury that are known to cause harm to the women, to the mothers or expectant mothers, but also to their unborn children, many of which are unfortunately born with IQ loss, neurological problems, the malformations, and other health situations. Another example is on PFAS, so-called forever chemicals, which, despite the scientific evidence, continue to be produced and marketed. And the dumping of wastes at sea continues. As I mentioned earlier, this situation is incompatible. Exposure to hazardous substances and this kind of contamination of the oceans is incompatible with several internationally protected human rights in the civil and political realm, such as the rights to life and physical integrity, information and participation, also on economic, social, cultural rights, rights to water, right to food, an adequate standard of living. And certainly this situation is incompatible with the enjoyment of a clean, healthy, and sustainable development. So what we're seeing is that the toxification of the planet as a whole reflects the lack of implementation of the right to science. I have real hope that my thematic report on this issue will bring further visibility to the right science in the specific context of toxics, which is particularly relevant to oceans issues that are under discussion in the conference in Lisbon. I think it makes sense to spend a few minutes talking about what does the right to science require? What is its content? And here we see that regional agreements, the International Covenant on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights, the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, they all speak to the right of society and everyone to benefit from scientific progress. Now, benefits to society do not occur without translation of scientific evidence into actual policies, into actual protections against the risks and harms of chemicals and wastes. And so this is a first element that is critical. It is the duty of states to take measures and align policies with the best available scientific evidence. Now, for that to happen, there are several related duties. For example, the availability and accessibility of scientific information. The science needs to be produced and it needs to be understandable. It needs to be accessible. That's why in my report, one of the recommendations is for the creation of a global platform for science policy interface that is free of conflict of interest. I am very pleased to see that the most recent session of the UN Environment Assembly in Nairobi in February took on this recommendation and prompted a process towards the creation of a global science policy interface platform that can scan the horizon, that can produce authoritative assessments, that can call for early warning, that can disseminate information, that can enhance education and awareness. So this goes all into the basket of availability and accessibility of scientific information. But there's of course more. There's engaging people and enabling citizen science. So this is an element of agency and empowerment. Science is not just what goes on in specialized laboratories. Of course, that's important, and scientists as a distinct community designs protocols and furthers the scientific method in order to produce scientific evidence. But that does not exclude the possibility to engage communities, to engage indigenous and other peoples in the scientific enterprise under the protocols designed by scientists. This fosters education, it fosters greater awareness, and it engages people then in the participation in decision-making on the basis of that scientific evidence. So there's that element of participation, which is a critical element of sustainable development. And then there's also the duty to support science on issues of public interest, because often we see a connection between technology and intellectual property. There is funding for scientific research only or predominantly on issues that are patentable and that can derive a private gain for the inventor and for the corporation that holds the patent. And that's an element of the prevailing regime under the World Trade Organization's trade-related intellectual property agreement, TRIPS agreement, but it does not exhaust the normative content of the right to science in respect of issues of public interest. Diseases, for example, that may affect people in poor countries that may not have the monies to buy patented medicines, but nevertheless are important from a public health dimension. When we think about oceans issues, the questions of global public interest in the global commons come to light, and the duty of states to support science to better understand those issues is critical here. So all of this goes in the direction of the duty to take measures and align with the best available scientific evidence as a core element of the right to science as it relates to toxics and environmental issues. So given the time, I wish to conclude with 2 points. The first one is, as I was mentioning, the right to science highlights the challenge of taking science to the hands of the people of the United Nations, the peoples of the world. This can foster agency, it can foster knowledge, it can foster empowerment, it can foster involvement in decision-making, which is an essential component of the sustainable development paradigm. And so in order to make the sustainable development goals a reality, here we have a huge challenge to take science into the hands of the people. And the second challenge or issue that I wish to conclude with is that the right to science offers humanity the tools to confront the toxification of the planet, including the oceans. We've seen recent scientific reports on how humanity is crossing planetary boundaries on climate change, on the water cycle, on the nitrogen cycle. Most recently, we've seen reports on the pollution burden on the global environment. Here we have a tool that relates to the right to a clean and healthy environment that is critical for humanity to reverse course, protect the oceans, protect people from exposure to toxics. Thank you very much to the organizers once again. Back to you, Lina, open to any reactions on questions that may arise later on.